Blood is thicker than water, but it dries just as ugly. When my sister sued me for half of the logistics empire I built from our father's ashes, I didn't scream. I just slid a battered manila envelope across the judge's mahogany desk. 10 seconds later, the courtroom echoed with laughter. The wood of the defendant's table was gouged with the nervous scratches of 1,000 desperate people who had sat here before me. I ran my thumbnail through a particularly deep groove, feeling the splintered oak catch against my cuticle. The courtroom smelled of lemon-scented industrial floor wax, old paper, and the overwhelming, cloying cloud of Santal 33 drifting from the plaintiff's table. Beatrix always wore too much perfume. It was a habit she developed in her 20s, a way to mask the scent of stale cigarette smoke and whatever bad decisions she'd made the night before. Today, it was supposed to smell like wealth, like quiet luxury. Instead, it just gave me a headache that pulsed right behind my left eye. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than the first delivery truck I ever bought. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing the part of the aggrieved, robbed daughter with terrifying perfection. My stomach gave a hollow, sour churn. I didn't feel the righteous, burning fury you see in movies. I just felt tired. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that sinks into your marrow and changes the way you walk. To understand the sheer audacity of Beatrix sitting 20 feet away, demanding 50% of Barrow Freight, you had to understand the day our father, Roman, died. It was raining. Not a cinematic, dramatic storm, just a miserable, freezing drizzle that made the asphalt look like slick black ice. The hospital room smelled of iodine, bleach, and the unmistakable metallic scent of failing kidneys. Roman was a hard man. A man who communicated entirely in grunts and slammed doors. He had spent 40 years running a regional trucking company into the ground, stubbornly refusing to adapt, refusing to upgrade, refusing to listen to anyone. When the heart monitor flatlined, there was no tearful goodbye, just the suffocating hiss of the ventilator stopping. Beatrix had shown up an hour later, smelling of vodka and peppermint gum. She didn't look at the body. She looked at me, her eyes wide and calculating. "What did he leave?" she had asked. Not "how did it happen?" Not "are you okay?" The lawyer told us the next day. Roman left a crumbling warehouse, 3 rusted-out tractor trailers, and $6.2 million in debt. He owed the IRS. He owed the bank. He owed men who didn't send letters on stationery, but instead sent heavy-set guys in leather jackets to stand quietly by the chain-link fence of the freight yard. There was a life insurance policy, $50,000. It was the only unencumbered asset he had. "I want the cash," Beatrix had said, sitting in the lawyer's dusty office, aggressively filing her nails. "You can have the business, Clora. I know you always wanted to play in the dirt." I was 24. I had a degree in supply chain management that I was still paying off, and a hollow ache in my chest that I mistook for duty. I told her the business was completely underwater. I told her taking the cash and running would leave me to deal with the creditors alone. She just smiled. It was a thin, bloodless thing. "That sounds like a you problem, sweetie. I'm moving to Milan." She took the check. She walked out. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence in that office was so heavy it felt like it was crushing my lungs. For the next 10 years, I didn't live. I survived. I slept on an army cot in the dispatcher's office. The smell of diesel exhaust and burnt vending machine coffee seeping so deeply into my skin that I stopped noticing it. I woke up at 3 in the morning to patch tires myself because I couldn't afford a mechanic. I argued with angry creditors until my voice was hoarse, begging for extensions, restructuring debt, playing a terrifying game of financial roulette every single Friday just to make payroll. I remember the texture of the cold, grease-stained steering wheel of truck number 2. I remember the copper tang of blood in my mouth when I slipped on a patch of ice in the yard and split my lip, lying there in the freezing mud, wondering if it would just be easier to stay down. But I didn't stay down. I rebuilt it. I sold the scrap. I pivoted from regional haul to specialized, temperature-controlled logistics. I fought and I bled. and I slowly turned Roman's rotting carcass of a company into a behemoth. Barrow Freight now operated a fleet of 400 trucks across 3 time zones. We were valued at roughly $80 million. And yesterday, Beatrix had flown back from Europe, walked into a law firm, and filed a suit claiming she had been fraudulently induced into giving up her rightful half of the estate. "My client," the lawyer said. His voice, a practiced, resonant baritone, was young. She was grieving. She was manipulated. His name was Sullivan. He wore a pinstripe suit that fit a little too snugly around his shoulders and shoes that squeaked against the polished hardwood floor every time he pivoted. Squeak. Pause. Squeak. It was a deliberate pacing. Theatrics. He smelled faintly of dry cleaning fluid and expensive aftershave. I sat next to my own attorney, Morrison. Morrison was 65, had chronic heartburn, and wore off-the-rack suits that always looked a little rumpled. He was currently chewing on a peppermint, his jaw working rhythmically, his pen tapping a slow, irregular beat on his yellow legal pad. He didn't look worried, he just looked bored. "Clara Barrow," Sullivan continued, pointing a manicured finger in my direction, knew the potential of that company. She hid the true valuation from her grieving sister. She presented a false ledger, terrifying Beatrix with exaggerated claims of debt, effectively forcing her to accept a paltry $50,000 while Clara seized an empire. I bit the inside of my cheek. I bit it hard enough to taste iron. Exaggerated claims of debt. My mind flashed to a Tuesday in November, 8 years ago. The electricity had been shut off in the main office. I was sitting at my desk in my winter coat, my breath pluming in the freezing air, staring at an eviction notice. I had eaten half a sleeve of stale saltine crackers for dinner. I was so exhausted I was hallucinating shadows moving in the corners of the room. Where was the empire then? Where was Beatrix? She was in Ibiza. I knew, because she had accidentally pocket-dialed me at 2 a.m., and I had listened to the thumping bass of a nightclub and her drunken laughter for 3 minutes before hanging up. "It is a classic case of fiduciary breach and elder abuse adjacent manipulation, Your Honor," Sullivan said, turning to Judge Hamilton. Judge Hamilton looked like a man who was counting the days to his pension. His robes hung loosely on his frail frame, and he had a habit of rubbing his temples as if the very air in the room gave him a migraine. He peered down at Sullivan over the rims of his half-glasses. "Counselor," Hamilton said, his voice gravelly, "the father was deceased at the time of the agreement. Elder abuse adjacent is not a legal standard. It's a buzzword." Sullivan didn't miss a beat. "Squeak! Squeak! Forgive me, Your Honor. The point remains. Beatrix was deceived. We have financial experts prepared to testify that the underlying assets, the real estate, the trucking routes, were worth millions even at the time of Roman Barrow's death." I looked at Beatrix again. She was staring at me now. The tissue was gone. Her eyes were dry, hard, and glittering with a naked, ugly greed. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible smirk. Just a twitch of the lips. It was that smirk that made my hands shake, not from fear, but from a sudden, violently physical surge of adrenaline. It was the same adrenaline I used to feel when a rig broke down on a mountain pass in a blizzard, and I had to figure out how to keep the driver from freezing to death. It was the contradiction of family. Half of me wanted to leap across the table and wrap my hands around her throat. The other half, the pathetic, bruised inner child, remembered when I was 7 and scraped my knee on the gravel driveway, and Beatrix had sneaked a Band-Aid from the bathroom and put it on me so Roman wouldn't hear me crying and yell at us. How do you reconcile the sister who patched your knee with the parasite trying to swallow you whole? You don't. You just bury it. "They have a letter," Morrison whispered, leaning toward me. His breath was entirely peppermint and old coffee. "Sullivan's about to introduce Exhibit C. He sent it over in Discovery last night." Right on cue, Sullivan picked up a piece of paper enclosed in a plastic sleeve. "Your Honor, we submit this handwritten letter penned by Roman Barrow 3 days before his passing. In it, he explicitly states his desire for his daughters to share equally in the business. He notes his fear that Clara, quote, has a ruthless streak and might try to shut her sister out." A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I leaned forward, staring at the plastic sleeve. "Objection! Morrison said, standing up slowly. We haven't authenticated that document. The plaintiff produced it magically 12 hours ago. The deceased had a tremor so bad he couldn't hold a spoon his last month alive, let alone write a perfectly legible manifesto. It was found in a safety deposit box my client only recently gained access to, Sullivan countered smoothly. Beatrix nodded solemnly, dabbing her dry eyes again. I felt a genuine physical wave of nausea. She had forged it. I knew Roman's handwriting. It was an erratic, heavy scrawl, letters pressed so hard into the paper they usually tore the page. But more than that, I knew Roman. He never used the word ruthless like it was a bad thing. He would have considered it a compliment, and he never cared enough about either of us to worry about us sharing anything. I'll allow it provisionally, Judge Hamilton sighed, waving a liver-spotted hand. But you better have an expert willing to swear on their license that it's real, Mr. Sullivan. Sullivan smiled. We do, Your Honor. Morrison sat back down. He looked at me, his gray eyebrows raised. Well, she's going all in. Fraud, perjury, the whole circus. She thinks I'm going to settle, I whispered, the realization settling into my bones like lead. She thinks I'll pay her $10 million right now just to make this go away and keep the company out of a protracted legal freeze. Will you? Morrison asked quietly. I looked down at the leather satchel resting by my feet. The leather was scuffed, the brass buckles dull. Inside it was a thick, heavy manila envelope. I had carried it with me for 5 years. I never thought I would actually have to use it. I kept it the way a person keeps a loaded gun in a safe, hoping it gathers dust, but knowing it's there. No, I said, my voice barely a rasp. I'm not paying her a dime. The afternoon sun shifted, cutting through the high windows of the courtroom and casting long, barred shadows across the floor. The heat in the room was rising, the archaic air conditioning system rattling uselessly in the ceiling. I could feel a line of sweat trickling down my spine, soaking into the cotton of my blouse beneath my blazer. Sullivan was relentless. For an hour, he painted a picture of me that belonged in a comic book. I was the evil mastermind, the greedy troll hoarding the gold under the bridge. He pulled up old bank statements showing the $50,000 transfer to Beatrix's account. He made it look like a bribe. He made it look dirty. And so, Sullivan concluded, pacing back to his table and leaning over it with both hands flat on the wood, we ask the court to invalidate the initial transfer of assets, place Barrow Freight in an immediate receivership, and order a full, independent audit to determine Beatrix Barrow's rightful half of the $50 million valuation. A low murmur rippled through the few paralegals and clerks in the gallery. Receivership. It was a death sentence. It meant court-appointed strangers freezing our accounts, halting operations, telling my drivers they couldn't buy diesel, telling my dispatchers their paychecks were on hold. It would kill the company in 3 weeks. Beatrix knew exactly what she was doing. She was putting a gun to the head of the only thing I loved, demanding I hand over the wallet to save its life. Judge Hamilton took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Mr. Morrison, your witness. Morrison stood up. He didn't pace. He didn't squeak. He just stood behind his chair, looking like a tired grandfather who had been dragged out of bed. Your Honor, Morrison said, his voice gravelly and calm. The defense doesn't have a long narrative. We don't have a surprise, unauthenticated letter from a dead man. He paused, looking directly at Beatrix. What we have is a timeline and a receipt. Sullivan frowned, leaning back in his chair. Beatrix's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, just a tiny tightening of the muscles around her mouth. Call the defendant to the stand, Morrison said. I stood up. My knees felt stiff, the joints popping loudly in the quiet room. I walked to the wooden box, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. The seat was hard. The microphone in front of me smelled faintly of metal and somebody else's stale breath. Miss Barrow, Morrison said, approaching the stand, let's clear up the history. When your father died, what was the exact financial status of the company? $6.2 million in verified debt, I said, my voice steady, projecting across the room. We were in default on 3 commercial loans. The IRS had placed a lien on the main terminal, and your sister took the $50,000 insurance payout? Yes. Did she sign a waiver relinquishing her rights to the company at that time? She did, I said. But as Mr. Sullivan pointed out, she now claims I misled her about the value. Morrison nodded slowly. Right, the manipulation. So, let's move forward in time. Let's talk about 5 years ago. Year 5 of you running Barrow Freight. My chest tightened. The memories came flooding back, thick and suffocating. Year 5 was the turning point. I had managed to consolidate the debt. We had just landed a massive contract with a national grocery chain to handle their refrigerated transport. For the first time in 60 months, I wasn't waking up terrified. The company was finally breathing. And then, the phone rang. Miss Barrow, Morrison prompted gently. 5 years ago, did you have contact with your sister? Yes, I said, looking away from Morrison and staring directly at Beatrix. Her face was perfectly blank now. The mask was locked in place. She came back to the States. She found me at the freight yard. I remembered the smell of the yard that day. Wet asphalt, diesel exhaust, and the sharp tang of ozone before a thunderstorm. Beatrix had stepped out of a leased Mercedes wearing suede shoes, tiptoeing through the puddles of dirty oil. Why did she seek you out? Morrison asked. She was in trouble, I said. My voice dropped an octave, losing the projection, becoming raw. She had spent the 50,000. She had spent whatever else she conned out of people in Europe, and she had developed a habit. Objection! Sullivan snapped, shooting out of his chair. Relevance! And highly prejudicial. Goes to motive, Your Honor, Morrison countered instantly. The plaintiff is claiming she was manipulated into giving up her rights 10 years ago. We are establishing her state of mind and financial reality during a subsequent, critical interaction. Overruled, Judge Hamilton grumbled. But tread lightly. Morrison, what kind of habit, Miss Barrow? Gambling. Mostly underground tables in London and Monaco. She owed a lot of money to people who don't take payment plans. I swallowed, remembering the dark bruises on Beatrix's arms she had tried to hide with a silk blouse. She owed $150,000. They told her if she didn't pay in a week, they would break her legs. Then they would come find me. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Sullivan had stopped moving. And what did she ask of you? Morrison said. She asked me to pay it. I looked down at my hands. They were calloused, scarred from engine heat, and snapped cargo straps. She knew the company was finally turning a profit. She demanded I bail her out. And did you? I looked up. I looked at the judge, then at Sullivan, and finally at Beatrix. I did. Why? Morrison asked softly. Because I didn't want her to die, I said. The truth tasted bitter on my tongue, because no matter how much I despised her, she was the only blood I had left. Beatrix rolled her eyes, a quick, dismissive flutter of her eyelashes. It was that tiny, arrogant movement that killed the last shred of pity I had left in my heart. Miss Barrow, Morrison said, turning his back to the gallery and facing me. Did you just give her the money, out of the goodness of your heart? No, I said. My voice was no longer raw. It was cold, cold as the metal walls of a refrigerated trailer. I knew who she was. I knew that if Barrow Freight ever became truly successful, she would come back again. She would keep bleeding me until there was nothing left. So, I made a condition. I reached down to my side. I unbuckled the leather satchel. I pulled out the heavy manila envelope. The paper was thick, textured, slightly yellowed at the edges from sitting in a safe for half a decade. I told her I would pay the debt, I said, holding the envelope in my lap. In exchange, we went to an independent notary, not my lawyer, a third party, and we drafted a new, comprehensive agreement. Morrison turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Defense Exhibit 1 into evidence. I have copies for the plaintiff and the bench. Morrison walked over, took the envelope from my hands, and carried it to Judge Hamilton's desk. He handed a duplicate folder to Sullivan. Sullivan ripped it open. The squeaking of his shoes stopped completely. He stared at the documents inside. I watched his face. I watched the practiced, arrogant flush drain from his cheeks, replaced by a pasty, sickly gray. Inside that envelope was a 40-page contract. It wasn't just a waiver. It was a legally bulletproof wall, drafted by a firm that specialized in hostile corporate severances. "Miss Barrow," Morrison said, his voice ringing clearly in the quiet room, "could you describe what is in that envelope?" "It is a master settlement and release agreement," I said. I knew the words by heart. I had read them 1,000 times when I was exhausted and needed to remind myself I was safe. In exchange for a cashier's check of $150,000, Beatrix Barrow agreed to surrender in perpetuity any and all claims, past, present, and future, to the estate of Roman Barrow, to Barrow Freight LLC, and to me personally. "Is there anything else in the envelope?" Morrison asked. "Yes," I said. I looked at Beatrix. She was frozen. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed panic. There is a signed affidavit from Beatrix, swearing under penalty of perjury that she had independent legal counsel review the document. There is a digital thumbprint attached to the signature page. And there is a transcription of an audio recording made by the notary, in which Beatrix explicitly acknowledges the company's new valuation, stating she doesn't care if it's worth $1 billion, she just wants the cash to pay off her bookie. Sullivan was frantically flipping through the pages, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Your Honor, we need time to review this. We had no idea." "You had no idea because your client lied to you, Mr. Sullivan," Morrison said dryly. "She conveniently forgot that she already sold her rightful half 5 years ago to save her own kneecaps." Judge Hamilton put his glasses back on. He opened the envelope. He spent 2 minutes reading the first few pages in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. Then Judge Hamilton looked at the signature page. He looked at the attached still photograph of Beatrix sitting in the notary's office, holding her ID, glaring at the camera with undeniable irritation. The judge looked up at Beatrix. Then he looked at Sullivan. And then Judge Hamilton let out a sound. It started as a low rumble in his chest, a dry wheeze of disbelief. It climbed up his throat, breaking through his judicial composure. He laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was a harsh, cynical bark of pure incredulity. The sound bounced off the wood paneling, sharp and humiliating. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Hamilton said, wiping a sudden tear of mirth from his eye, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did you even ask your client if she had signed anything else before you filed a $10 million fraud suit in my courtroom?" Sullivan opened his mouth, closed it, and slowly sank into his chair. He didn't look at Beatrix. He looked like a man who realized he was strapped to a bomb. Beatrix's face had turned the color of spoiled milk. Her perfectly manicured hands were trembling so violently they rattled against the table. That's not," she stammered, the elegant facade crumbling into a desperate, ugly whine. "She forced me. I was under duress." "Duress?" Judge Hamilton leaned forward, the laughter gone, replaced by a terrifying, cold authority. "The transcription here says, and I quote, 'Give me the damn pen, Clora, you stupid mule. I don't care about your garbage company.' Doesn't sound like duress, Miss Barrow. Sounds like a very eager seller." Silence in a courtroom is never actually empty. It has a texture. Right now it felt like static electricity, the kind that makes the fine hairs on your arm stand up just before a lightning strike. Judge Hamilton didn't stop laughing immediately. The sound just evolved into a wet, congested cough that required him to press a handkerchief to his mouth. When he finally lowered it, his eyes were devoid of any remaining amusement. They were flat, hard, and fixed squarely on Sullivan. Sullivan looked like a man who had stepped off a curb and realized too late that a city bus was occupying the crosswalk. He was frantically backing away from his own client, creating a physical gap between his expensive pinstripe suit and Beatrix's tailored navy blazer. "Your Honor," Sullivan stammered, the smooth, resonant baritone entirely gone, replaced by a reedy, panicked pitch. "I." The plaintiff did not disclose the existence of this master settlement to me. I was retained under the explicit assurance that no subsequent agreements existed. "Shut up, Sullivan," Hamilton growled. It wasn't a judicial reprimand. It was a bark from an old man who had zero patience left for the theater. You filed a multi-million-dollar fraud claim, demanded receivership of a massive interstate logistics firm, and submitted a highly suspicious holographic will without running a basic due diligence check on your own client's financial history. You are a clown. Sullivan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He didn't say another word. He just began shoving his meticulously organized legal pads into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches with a frantic metallic clicking. Click. Clack. He was abandoning ship. Beatrix realized it a second later. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice loud enough to carry across the 10 feet of polished oak separating our tables. She grabbed Sullivan's forearm. "You can't just quit. We have the letter." "Daddy's letter." Sullivan ripped his arm away as if she were contagious. He leaned in, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper that echoed in the cavernous room. "That letter is a forgery, Beatrix. I knew it. You knew it. I was willing to risk it when I thought we were extorting a sibling who didn't keep receipts. But you signed a notarized affidavit. You perjured yourself on my watch. If I don't walk out of here right now, I lose my license." Beatrix stood up. The elegant chignon had loosened, a stark blonde lock falling across her face. The mask of the aggrieved, grieving daughter shattered completely, revealing the rabid, cornered animal underneath. "It's not fair," she screamed, pointing a manicured, trembling finger at me. "She stole it. She manipulated the books. She made me think it was worthless." I didn't move. I sat perfectly still beside Morrison, feeling the worn fabric of my slacks against the wooden chair. My stomach wasn't doing flips. It felt like a canvas bag full of loose, cold gravel. I watched my sister, the girl who used to sneak me popsicles when Roman was passed out in his recliner, the girl who taught me how to braid my hair, completely unravel. It wasn't triumphant. It was pathetic. It smelled like sour sweat cutting through the cloying Santal 33. "She built an empire while I have nothing," Beatrix shrieked, her voice cracking, echoing off the high plaster ceiling. "She owes me. I am her blood." "Sit down, Miss Barrow," Judge Hamilton commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Beatrix ignored him. She was hyperventilating now, leaning over the plaintiff's table, her eyes wide and wild, fixated entirely on me. "You think you're so smart, Clora? You think a piece of paper means anything? I'll drag you through appeals. I'll go to the press. I'll tell them you starved our father. I'll tell them you—" "Bailiff," Judge Hamilton said sharply. The heavy, measured footsteps of the armed court officer echoed against the hardwood floor, moving up the center aisle. Beatrix finally froze, looking over her shoulder at the uniformed man approaching her table. The reality of the room, of the armed officer, of the furious judge, finally seemed to penetrate her panic. She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands, letting out a jagged, ugly sob. Judge Hamilton picked up his gavel. He didn't bang it. He just held it in his hand, pointing the wooden head at the plaintiff's table. "This case is dismissed with prejudice," Hamilton stated, his voice heavy and slow. "Counselor Sullivan, you have 24 hours to withdraw yourself formally from this disaster before I file a grievance with the Bar Association myself. And Miss Barrow." He paused, looking down at Beatrix, who was still rocking slightly in her chair. "You are incredibly fortunate that defense counsel," he nodded toward Morrison, "has not filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution. Because if they had, I would be turning you over to the district attorney for perjury and attempted extortion right now. Take your forged letter, take your greed, and get out of my courtroom." He struck the gavel, a sharp, definitive crack that made me flinch. "Court is adjourned." Morrison let out a long, slow breath beside me. The scent of peppermint and old coffee washed over me again. He reached out and patted my shoulder, a clumsy, grandfatherly gesture. "It's over, Clora. You kept the trucks." I looked at the manila envelope still resting on the judge's bench, the paper that had saved my life. I didn't feel a surge of victory. I just felt an overwhelming, crushing need to sleep. I didn't wait for Beatrix to gather her things. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my blazer, and walked down the center aisle. The double oak doors of the courtroom felt unnaturally heavy as I pushed them open, stepping out into the harsh, fluorescent-lit hallway. The air out here was stale, smelling of floor polish and the nervous sweat of hundreds of people waiting for their own tragedies to be called. I walked toward the elevators, my boots clicking softly against the linoleum. Clara, wait! I stopped. I didn't want to. Every muscle in my back tightened, a purely physical rejection of the voice echoing down the corridor behind me. I closed my eyes for 2 seconds, took a slow breath of the recycled air, and turned around. Beatrix was jogging toward me. Her heels clicked frantically, out of rhythm. The blazer was unbuttoned, her hair a messy tangle around her face. Up close, under the brutal fluorescent lights, she looked older. The stress had carved deep, bitter lines around her mouth, and the expensive skin treatments couldn't hide the gray, exhausted pallor beneath her makeup. She stopped 3 feet away, chest heaving. The Santal 33 was gone, completely overpowered by the acrid scent of pure fear. Clara, she panted, her eyes darting around the empty hallway before locking onto mine. The hostility from the courtroom was gone. Now, she was trying on a different mask, the helpless victim. The little girl lost. What do you want, Beatrix? My voice sounded completely dead, flat as a blown tire. You can't just walk away, she whispered, taking a step closer, reaching out a trembling hand as if to touch my arm. I took a step back. Her hand dropped, hanging limply at her side. I have nothing. The lawyers took the last of my savings as a retainer. I don't have a hotel. I don't have a flight back. That sounds like a you problem, I said quietly. She flinched. The exact words she had said to me 10 years ago in the lawyer's office, handed back to her. Please. A tear finally spilled over, ruining her mascara, carving a black track down her cheek. I'm your sister. I made a mistake. I was desperate. The people I owe money to now, they aren't like the bookies in London. Clara, please. Just $1 million. $500,000. You wouldn't even notice it's gone. You have $80 million. I stared at her. I looked at the dark tracks of mascara, the trembling lip, the sheer pathetic desperation radiating from her pores. For a fraction of a second, the internal contradiction flared again, the phantom memory of her brushing my hair when I was sick. The twisted, ingrained societal guilt that tells you family is an absolute, unbreakable bond, regardless of the toxicity. But then I remembered the smell of the dispatcher's office. I remembered eating saltines for dinner. I remembered the cold, terrifying weight of Roman's debt crushing my chest while she danced in Ibiza. I remembered the absolute certainty I felt an hour ago when she smirked at me, fully intending to destroy the lives of 400 employees just to line her pockets. Blood is thicker than water, but diesel fuel is what kept me alive. I don't have $80 million, Beatrix, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, completely devoid of anger. The company has an $80 million valuation. The money is in the trucks. It's in the warehouses. It's in the salaries of the people who actually work for a living. I take a moderate salary. I drive a heavy-duty pickup with a dent in the bumper. I don't have cash to give you. You could liquidate, she hissed, a flash of the old, entitled Beatrix breaking through the tears. You could sell a division. I could, I nodded slowly. But I won't. I paid your ransom 5 years ago. That was my last act as your sister. The contract is signed. The transaction is complete. We are nothing to each other now. You're a monster, she spat, her face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly hatred. Dad was right. You are ruthless. You're going to die alone in a greasy garage, Clara. Maybe, I said. I turned away from her and pressed the heavy metal button for the elevator. But at least I'll own the garage. The elevator dinged. The steel doors slid open. I stepped inside, turned around, and looked at her one last time. She was standing perfectly still in the middle of the corridor, staring at me, her fists clenched at her sides. She looked incredibly small. The doors slid shut, cutting her off. I walked out of the courthouse into the blinding glare of the late afternoon sun. The heat of the concrete radiated through the soles of my boots. The city smelled of exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, and roasting nuts from a nearby vendor cart. It was the smell of industry, the smell of work. I found my truck in the parking garage. It was a 3/4-ton pickup, dark gray, coated in a fine layer of dust from the freight yard. I unlocked it, climbed into the cab, and slammed the heavy door shut. The silence inside the cabin was immediate, a thick, insulated barrier against the noise of the city. I tossed my leather satchel onto the passenger seat. I gripped the steering wheel. The leather cover was worn smooth at the 10 and 2 positions, molded perfectly to the shape of my hands over the last 100,000 miles. I turned the key. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a deep guttural vibration that shuddered through the floorboards and up into my bones. It was a familiar, comforting rhythm. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel for a long time, just listening to the engine idle, smelling the faint, stale aroma of empty coffee cups sitting in the center console. I was exhausted. My head pounded. My family was entirely, permanently gone. But as I shifted the truck into gear and pulled out of the dark garage into the blazing light of the street, the crushing weight I had carried for 10 long years finally lifted. I was alone. But for the first time in my life, I was completely, undeniably free. If this story hit a nerve, or if you know what it's like to build something from nothing only to have someone try and tear it down, hit that like button. It helps push these raw, grounded stories to people who need to hear them. Share it with someone who needs a reminder to protect their peace. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about survival, grit, and the messy reality of being human. See you next time.